So imagine this. You just finished an anime that absolutely blew your mind, and all you think about is how much you want another masterpiece exactly like it, until you realize that nothing will ever replace that same magic. But suddenly you hear that they're expanding the story and making a sequel, and you're extremely excited, and ready to capture that same incredible feeling. So when it comes out, you jump straight to it. And somehow, even though all the pieces are still there, the magic is gone. On the other hand, we've also experienced the magic of a story that not only lived up to the expectations of its prequel, they surpassed them. But what's the actual difference between these two? To find the answer to this question, I'm gonna compare some of the best sequels to some of the worst. And by the end, we'll finally understand why some sequels work, and others completely missed the point. In my opinion, I think great sequels usually understand 3 very important rules, and the first one might also be the most significant. You see, a sequel has to evolve its story, not just visually, not just structurally, but emotionally. Let's take Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo for an example. It succeeds because instead of repeating Jujutsu Kaisen, it built upon and crafted its own story to tell. We got new characters, conflicts, and themes, while also answering the questions from JJK that never got resolution. Steel Ball Run evolves its story in a similar way. It abandons JoJo's continuity, but preserves the soul of JoJo's, creating something that still feels new, while still exploring those same ideas that made JoJo's compelling in the first place. Or even something like Fate, which is able to constantly produce successful sequels because it reinvents its characters, timelines, and settings, while repeatedly exploring the same waifus just in different colors. But then, we have Boruto, and yeah, we all know the problem with this. Because despite introducing an entirely new generation, the emotional gravity of the series still revolves around Naruto. The world changes, the characters change, and the villains change, but the story never escapes the shadow of the original series. Naruto and Sasuke still dominate the emotional weight of the world. They still dominate the audience's investment, and they still feel larger than the story trying to replace them. So Boruto ends up trapped in a very difficult position, trying to recreate the same impact left by Naruto, and failing at every step of the journey. And it's obvious why. Naruto was the underdog who struggled to be accepted by the world. He's alone, parentless, and literally and metaphysically lives with his demons. But Boruto doesn't have that same pain. He's living the easy life, a spoiled brat whose only problem is the fact that his father's too busy to spend time with him, because he's running the entire village. Like, they try to get you emotionally invested in this new era, but they always miss the mark, constantly feeding off the same characters like Naruto and Sasuke, and when they run their course, they disrespect those same characters that we loved, either turning them into plot devices or something in between. But the crazy thing is that these are just side problems. The biggest issue with Boruto actually predated its true existence. Boruto failed because everybody just saw it as a cash cow, milking the franchise for what it had left. And it all started with one single character, Kaguya. You see, Kaguya for many people never felt like the natural conclusion to Naruto's story. She wasn't built up like Madara. She didn't carry that same emotional presence, and her sudden introduction completely changed the direction of the world itself. The series shifts from ninja mythology into aliens, prophecy, and cosmic bloodlines almost overnight. And whether people like that direction or not, it fundamentally changes what Naruto even was. And that became a massive problem for Boruto, because now the sequel inherits a conflict that already feels disconnected from the emotional foundation that people originally fell in love with. And that's why for so many viewers, Boruto stops feeling like a natural continuation of Naruto. It starts feeling like a franchise, trying to justify a continuation after the story already emotionally ended. And Dragon Ball Super runs into a very similar problem, just in a completely different way, because unlike Boruto, Super doesn't struggle with inheritance, it struggles with repetition. You see, Dragon Ball Z already felt like a complete emotional journey. We gotta see this kid Goku struggle and fight during his early childhood. We gotta see him grow up as an adult and a father, and later a Saiyan and also a hero. Someone respected for his strength and willpower, where even the likes of Vegeta praised him as the stronger fighter. It was like we were growing up with Goku. And so the conclusion of Z hit that much harder. The world finally felt peaceful, like these characters had earned rest after decades of fighting. But Super interrupts that peace instantly. The world is no longer as peaceful as we imagined. There are external threats waiting for our heroes to fight. Villains far greater and stronger than anything that we thought was possible. It's almost like everything that Goku fought for didn't mean anything at all. And for a lot of fans, it was kind of a slap in the face. I mean, yeah, more Dragon Ball content is good, but if you care about these characters, you care about the story, it just doesn't fit. It changes the emotional weight of Dragon Ball completely, because instead of naturally progressing and evolving the story, Super often feels like it's trying to endlessly recreate those same stakes and conflicts that we saw in Dragon Ball Z. Like these new transformations that often don't hold the same impact, or these elevated stakes and fights that feel like they're empty and hollow, or like these new cast of villains that fail to even come close to eclipsing those other predecessors. And individually, some of these ideas are actually pretty cool, but it's always the execution that misses the mark, and that creates a massive problem, because Dragon Ball's transformations were never memorable purely because they looked cool. They were meaningful and stood out because of everything that surrounded them. Super Saiyan worked because it was emotional. Gohan going all out against Cell worked because we all felt that same rage and pain. And that's what drives Dragon Ball's best moments. It's the emotion. It's the feeling you get when they push their limits. And this is where I can give credit to Ultra Instinct, because it feels the most spiritually connected to Goku from Dragon Ball Z. Like we're seeing his ascension as a martial artist and a fighter and a Saiyan. But eventually it just recreates the same problem, where in general many of Super's forms stop feeling like emotional evolution, and they start feeling more like recognizable franchise milestones. Almost like an expansion on a corporate level. It's the Boruto problem. They're milking the series for what it has left, and it debases every aspect that made Dragon Ball so good in the first place. And in one hand, I can almost understand it, because Dragon Ball is one of the biggest anime franchises in the world. From a purely business standpoint, it just makes sense, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the art is lost, and you can feel that in every corner of the series, especially with Goku. Because Goku in Dragon Ball Z was simple, but he was wise when it came to battle. But Dragon Ball Super strips away all of that nuance, and they give us this simpleton, someone who's purely childish, someone who's a battle-hardened demon. And that's not the Goku we grew up with. And that's why Super fails as a sequel, and why so much of Super's criticism keeps revolving around the same feelings. It's because they're always trying to recreate those iconic Dragon Ball moments, but it never feels genuine. It always feels like a cheap copy. Okay, so now that we have evolution, it's time to make a second rule work, and that's where we get identity, because the soul of the story is what matters more than the actual plot. And the best sequels understand what deserves to be inherited, taking the ideas that the original story left behind and evolving them into something entirely different. And the easiest way to understand why identity matters is to look at the series that mastered this better than most sequels in anime history. And of course, I'm talking about Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo. With a hype built around JJK, fans were universally upset about how it ended. There were all these plot lines and unanswered questions left unresolved, and so a sequel was something we actually all desperately wanted. And from the characters, the themes, and the writing, Modulo did everything right. It wasn't obsessed with recreating JJK's biggest moments. It wasn't trying to manufacture another Gojo, another Sukuna, another Shibuya incident. It was just trying to tell its own story that was completely different from what we got with the main series, while still tapping into everything that the main series did right. JJK was already this philosophical discussion about suffering, strength, and the willpower of human emotion. So what does Modulo do? We see a completely different perspective of what these themes mean. Modulo feels like a genuine continuation. The world's changed, but these things keep on spinning. And somehow it also follows the daunted-on approach and introduces aliens. But weirdly enough, it doesn't feel strange. Somehow it actually works. It feels like a natural evolution, while still retaining that Jujutsu identity. And that's because even across the universe, we still see those same concepts. And it's actually this juxtaposition between human and alien that's used as a vehicle to explore the most important concepts in Modulo, while also expanding and exploring those ideas that were left behind. That's why it works so good as a sequel. It took a completely different approach, but still remembered where it started. And honestly, the best sequels almost always work this way. They evolve, but never forget what they are. Boruto suffered because before Chapter 1 it lost that identity, and failed to evolve the plot from ninjas to aliens. But what happens when a sequel manages to do both? What happens when it evolves the story, without losing its identity? Well, that's where series like JoJo's and Fate truly shine. Let's take a look at Steel Ball Run. JoJo's is a series built across multiple different parts, with different protagonists, different stories, and different themes. But from parts 1 through 6, everything still exists within this same timeline. There's overarching conflict between the Joestar family and Dio. And no matter how different each part becomes, they're each connected by the same history. But then Araki did something that on paper should have been a disaster. He broke away from the timeline. He created a new world, new characters, an entirely new story from the ground up, and somehow, it not only worked, it became his magnum opus. And that's because it almost feels like Araki took away from every singular mistake and failure that he made in every other previous part. And that's where we get Steel Ball Run. It has the same grandiose adventure of part 3, without the way that it drags on from the plot. It eliminates the episodic structure that we see in part 4, by tying every conflict and character to the central themes and powers that are existing within this universe. But despite all of that, it still feels unmistakably like JoJo's. And that's because out of countless versions, countless variations, and countless parts, Araki eventually learned something very, very important. He didn't need to preserve JoJo's continuity. He just needed to preserve its soul and spirit. And so Steel Ball Run succeeds because it combines JoJo's strongest elements. We got the dynamic of Johnny and Gyro that taps into some of the strongest character development that we've seen in the series. There's a consistently focused plot, there's meaningful stakes, and some of the franchise's most emotionally resonant themes in a single cohesive story. It's really not that hard to figure out. It does the two things that a sequel needs to do. It evolves and it retains its identity. And the Fate franchise works in a very similar way. You see, the reason why Fate works and why it's always going to constantly work is because they've mastered their concept and have learned how to consistently replicate it. They can reproduce various timelines with different heroes and pretty much just reskinned waifus, and it's always going to work because it always retains its core identity of what it's all about. But even on the more simple side, Fate wins simply because it's a consistently well-produced anime series. You see, Fate is a series that's produced by Ufotable. If you don't know who these guys are, they're the people who make Demon Slayer, and by golly, their unlimited budget works did numbers to this anime. And if we're being for real, a well-produced anime is always gonna do well. Doesn't matter what it is. But Fate specifically operates well in this format because it's kind of like a blank canvas, and all the other elements outside are like the various types of paint that they can brush on. You know, you got the Holy Grail Wars, you got all these heroes. There's just so much going on, there's a lot of creative freedom. But I think what really helps it out is the fact that Fate started as an eroge visual novel. And I'm not even joking, you can literally look this up. But because of that fact, it had all these different storylines and routes that they then could base off every various sequel that came out. And so they basically had like an infinite content glitch. Now they also have a mobile gacha game. I'm pretty sure they also have a series of arcade games. It's borderline repetition, but that's the winning strategy of Fate. They can just copy paste and their audience is always going to eat it up. And it's because they're serving that audience, which is why their sequels always hit well. Also the femboys. Now JJK JoJo's and Fate, they had a lot of things going for them. They evolved the story, they retained their core identity, and as a result their fans just loved it. But that's because they were all doing something else in the background. You see, even if you build up a franchise effectively, and it retains its core values, it's still not enough if fans can't resonate with the characters. And that's where we get into our third and final point, which is connection. Because sure, you can evolve the story, and sure, it can have its identity down to a T, but that doesn't mean it will automatically succeed if people can't love the characters. And The Legend of Korra faces this problem to an excruciating degree, because even though it expanded the Avatar world, and it maintained the concept of the series, the main issue of the show was actually Korra herself. You know, just take the original cast of Avatar. You know, you got the tragic redemption story of Zuko. You got the comedic relief within Sokka. The strength and will with Katara. And then you got Aang, the idealistic, optimistic protagonist, who consistently chooses the pacifist route in a world where people demand violence. And over time, we see these characters mature into adults as they face off against the world and the Fire Nation, thus designing their destruction under their authoritarian regime. And again, this is a kids show, but the concepts and character dynamics that they were engaging with, could fit practically every audience. But I think what's so important is that they were able to make you care about every individual character in the series. Like for example, when Appa was stolen from the entire crew, we felt that loss. Appa didn't say a single word in the entire show outside of a couple of noises, but goddamn, I love that Sky Bison to hell and back. And that's the beauty of Avatar. They dove deep into these characters, they extrapolated this emotional connection, and you felt that growth as you watched the show. But with Korra, I'll be honest, I don't give a about I don't give a fuck about any of these guys. Korra is stubborn, arrogant, often annoying, and I'll keep it a buck, she just sucks. If you say you like Korra, I don't believe you, because nobody likes Korra. Everything about Aang's journey felt natural, like he earned each achievement. As for Korra, it just felt half-assed and like it was given to her. Because while Aang was practically forced to learn all 4 elements before the end of the year, you have Korra, who is basically a prodigy from very early on, and so her degree of power seemed a lot less earned. On top of that, Aang was a very spiritual person, which is very much tapped into the core of what Avatar means. But Korra was the exact opposite, and so many of her biggest weaknesses were attempted to be portrayed as human. It just became frustrating. Now again, I'm trying to stop myself from turning this into a Korra hate video, but I think this ironic vitriol kinda stands to the point. You know, you can do everything right with a sequel, and there's a lot that Avatar Korra has going for it. I mean, for example, the cast of villains is great, but if you just mess up so badly on one of these characters, specifically their protagonist, then it just cooks the sequel. It just cooks the story. And honestly, I think that's why so many sequels fail. Not because they're bad stories per se, but because they miss the mark on why people love the original in the first place. A great sequel doesn't just continue the plot, it evolves the story, it preserves its identity, but most importantly, it gives us new characters worth caring about. Because at the end of the day, people don't just fall in love with franchises, they fall in love with stories. And if you can't evolve those stories without forgetting what made them special in the first place, you're no longer making a sequel. You're crafting a legacy.